I mean, shipping today represents about 93% of the global trade volumes of the world. So it's an obvious target for political pressure. And in a sense, it's a very soft target because the vessels are unarmed.
Hello and welcome to The Conversation. I'm Eleanor Saccardino, and today I'm speaking to George Mangos, who's the principal of the Interunity Group, a leading service provider to the global maritime industry. It's a family-run Greek shipping group of companies lauded for its technical and commercial management standards, highly rated fleet of tankers, and dry vessels and capital markets expertise. George, whilst he may not want me to say this, in 2019 was profiled as one of Lloyd's list's most promising entrepreneurs. No pressure. So if you could just give us an overview of the Interunity Group's commercial shipping business, that would be great. You know, average load volume, what you're carrying, delivery windows, shipping lanes, typically where you head if it's obviously global. Thank you.
Sure. So we work primarily with institutional partners. We currently run a fleet of 53 ships, primarily tankers, but we've also historically owned and controlled bulk carriers, containers, and various other vessel types. In terms of volumes, today we transport about 12 million metric tons of liquid bulk cargoes. That would be chemicals, product, edibles, inorganics, so acids, and so on. And historically, we also transport between 2 to 4 million metric tons of dry bulk cargoes.
Thank you.
We co-invest in debt structures and equity structures with sort of equal verve. That's, I think, a key differentiator. And we also operate one of the more successful chemical and product tanker systems globally under the banner of Sakana, where we control about 1 million deadweight of tankers today.
Okay. And you go, and your tankers go, or vessels go everywhere, I imagine.
Fully global. Fully global, although I would emphasize nothing Russia related. We're very, very careful about sanctions. And so nothing that isn't UN food program related.
Okay.
We avoid.
Okay. Or you mean nothing UN food program approved?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, that's a better word.
Okay. Just to be sure. Okay. So then there's the big thing, because obviously the shipping industry is largely managed, I feel, globally by Greeks, interestingly. Although Greece doesn't actually reap much benefit from that because it's not necessarily towards Greece. The ships run flags of convenience, FOGs as you call them. Can you explain to me how that works and why the Greeks are so good at it?
We're a little different because the substantial source of our co-equity is American institutional funds. So we actually have offices in the United States, in Denmark, in Germany, and in Greece, where we have the headquarters of the company. Trade is fully global. We don't really have a kind of a geographically specific focus. Greece is a cluster point where there is a great deal of expertise in the ecosystem around shipping. But I would say that we're seeing that form also in Hong Kong, Dubai, London. So there are other sort of major centers that would rival Greece for attention. In terms of your question on flags of convenience, it's a good question. There's been a tremendous amount of regulatory pressure over the last decades for shipping to bring its operating practices in line with international norms and standards. And the flagging of the vessels is a key part of that. The way that regulatory pressure has evolved is by denying countries and flags that have very poor records on safety, in terms of environment, in terms of human life, in terms of murkiness of source of funds and so on, denying them the ability to enter certain geographical regions, Europe, America, and a number of core Asian countries will not allow blacklisted flags of convenience to access their waters.
Interesting. See, there's a whole other world going on in the waters, isn't there? And so why are Greeks so good at this? The agility, I feel, comes to mind and is often quoted. What is it about Greeks and shipping?
I think a history being a history of connecting different cultures and of absorbing different cultures and of working closely with other nations certainly in the latter years. For example, I would credit the United States after the Second World War. The United States during the Second World War built up an enormous commercial fleet in order to support its efforts and its allies, and then auctioned this fleet off, which the Greeks bought a substantial number of these vessels, and then this helped basically create, running through the economic boom, the post-World War II economic boom, the Greeks managed to carve for themselves a niche as part of, let's say, this global framework. And we've tried to stay competitive ever since. But that's always evolved. And I think we're an example of that. So we bring together expertise in trading from a number of European countries. We marshal the strong institutional funds from the United States, and we mix it in with some Greek know-how. And, that's us today.
A healthy mix. It's good. The more mix, the better. I'm a big believer in that, being one myself. So let's talk about this Houthi, the current affairs, the Houthi hijack example, where Houthi rebels from Yemen attacked a vessel that they believed to belong to an Israeli. Then there were mixed reports that the vessel was actually British, possibly financed, also or part Japanese, and there were various discussions around that. Who does the vessel belong to, and where does the responsibility lie? I suppose it's spread amongst the different stakeholders. How does it work?
I would take a step back because I'm not qualified necessarily to speak on the facts of the particular case. But what I would say is that ever since, shipping today represents about 93% of the global trade volumes of the world. So it's an obvious target for political pressure. And in a sense, it's a very soft target because the vessels are unarmed. Ever since nations have begun, they form navies to protect their trade lanes. And this holds equally from antiquity through to the Middle Ages, the great empires of Venice and so on, and the British Empire, and more latterly now to the global footprint that America has around the world and that China has been building around the world in order to protect its trade lanes. So if you peel it back as an onion, you would say that the security responsibility starts with the literal state whose easy you are transiting. But then in international waters, the responsibility belongs to the flag state. So in this case, also, it'll be the flag state of the car carrier that is responsible for the security of the ship. But in the broader sense, it's going to be who is this trade lane aligned with and who is this asset aligned with? And effectively is what the Houthi targeted, what they perceived to be the asset of a particular nation as a form of pressure. Now, the real point that I would want to make here is that the the proximate victims are the crew. What they're trying to do is to make a living for their families. They have no political affiliation and no movement. And we experienced this as a company in 2010 when we had one of our tankers seized by Somali pirates for 3 months. And this was a particularly testing circumstance for everyone involved, but our experience paled into insignificance before what the crew experienced on board at the hands of the pirates. So I have a great deal of sympathy for particularly for the innocent people that have been caught up in this.
Thank you. You're right. Yes, let's hope they are safe soon. In the meantime, so maritime security is obviously a big issue and has been since the beginning of time, let's face it. But now we've seen we saw an uptick with the British, were notorious pirates, as we know, hundreds of years ago. So, but now we've seen a different kind of terrorism in the oceans, as you were just mentioning in your experience in 2010. Somalia, off the coast of Somalia, saw those sorts of situations and hijacks of vessels happen frequently at some point.
I would separate it out into two categories. You've got criminal activity that's based around economic pressures. So East Africa, obviously, as we just discussed, was one flashpoint. West Africa is today a flashpoint. And then you have political affiliations. For example, the Houthi capture of this car carrier. The responsibility is for the security is evolving. So in West Africa, you're seeing NATO, for example, stepping up as a partner of the littoral states in West Africa to try to assist them, because equally stabilizing the maritime environment helps the local economies, and that has an enormous positive externality for trade for the countries that are in NATO. This idea of trying to cover the open waters with these natural structures and try to share the responsibility. And the template for that was, in fact, East Africa, where NATO had started to take responsibility to try and organize the security of the navies that stepped into the Horn of Africa. So I would expect that that's going to continue to develop over time. Now, we're no longer in a unipolar world. As you said, we're now in a multipolar world. Mm-hmm. And so we can expect to see more competition and jostling around the security of trade lanes as countries that are aligned with one another or hostile to one another try to protect their interests. And in many ways, that's a return to the way it's been for most of shipping's history or most of human history at sea. But it certainly is a departure for all of us that have grown up in a post-World War II multilateral peace structure where certain norms were respected even between adversaries. So that's a very volatile and very environment. And ultimately, it's going to have consequences for, of course, people that are involved in the trade on a day-to-day basis, right through to consumers who are going to bear the cost of this increased cost of policing.
So security situation is getting bad in the ocean. So a return to olden days in a way. is interesting. It's a completely different world in a way to that, what, 30, 40 years ago. Is that fair?
Yes. Yes, very much so.
That's wild. I imagine it's disrupting trade. Your big issue, I imagine, is also just making sure you get your product from A to B. How much is that disturbing, or how are you feeling the pinch already?
Yes, our responsibility is to try and deliver that cargo safely, firstly, respecting and taking care of human life and the environment. And security is an intrinsic part of that. Our challenge is slightly broader in the sense that as a result of sanctions regimes, we are now seeing a bifurcation of these supply lines into, let's call them aligned and non-aligned countries that operate very different safety cultures, among other things. That's been a particular point of contention. It's not showing itself so much now, but unfortunately, from an environmental perspective and from a human perspective, when things go wrong at sea, they can go very wrong with devastating consequences. And it's sometimes difficult to create a proactive environment. It sometimes can be a very, very reactive environment. There's another circumstance or a case I could refer to you, again, linked to the Houthi, which is the floating storage facility which the rebels had taken over. It's called the Safer, the FSO Safer. After a lot of diplomacy from a number of different countries, it seems that we will be, the global community will be able to secure this vessel and move the oil that's on board the ship onto a much safer vessel, because unfortunately, through lack of maintenance from the beginning of the Yemeni war, the civil war, this asset is falling to pieces. And if it were to spill, it would, the chances are that it could coat a significant amount of the Saudi coast in the Red Sea. It could cause a collapse of fisheries in the Red Sea. It would devastate the tourism industry in the Red Sea. And this is a very obvious risk that's sitting in front of us. And the politics makes things, or can make things, very, very complicated. But I believe, at least in this case, after very patient negotiation in the UN and around the UN, finally we'll get a solution. So it's not all bad news, but we all need to be mindful of these challenges.
Thank you. Speaking of, you mentioned this, touched on this in your previous example, but your concern with environmental regulations and human life, but let's talk about the sustainability aspect. It's my understanding there are new regulations coming, structural, financial, and perhaps otherwise that I'm not aware of, besides the obvious environmental aspect, where we know shipping accounts for 3% of global carbon emissions, more or less. What new technologies are already required, and what are these regulations going to do to the shipping industry generally? Is it what are we looking at in terms of overhaul or reform?
The structure of the market is as close to perfect competition as you can get. And that means that collaboration is very, very difficult. So you look to regulators effectively to try and help create a sandbox in which everyone should be trying to compete on an equal footing, or getting as close to that as you can. Because shipping is subject to very different regulatory regimes all around the world, and that is a legacy of maritime law effectively being centuries old. If you compare it, for example, to aviation law, which has a very well integrated regulatory framework around the world, and it's a duopoly of production between Boeing and Airbus, it's much easier to affect regulatory change in a consistent way. What I would say, though, is that there have been some very significant strides in shipping over the last decades. Oil spills, are down to about 5% of where they were in the 1970s. And latterly, since 2020, shipping has achieved a major milestone in terms of SOx and NOx emissions. So while our carbon footprint as an industry is very positive compared to the amount of goods that we transport around the world, not many people know that global shipping was producing about 50% of the NOx of the global car fleet and 10 times as much SOx as the global car fleet. And that was dealt with in very dramatically in 2020 with regulations around the control of sulfur in the fuel. So we've achieved these dramatic strides, with some changes. So it wasn't uniformly applied. There were a range of different approaches to it, everything down to having to build almost like mini refineries on board the ship to actually separate out the sulfur from the fuel, which sounds pretty crazy when you consider that that's something that could have been dealt with at the refinery in a more efficient way. But that's shipping. But it was done. And similarly with CO2, it's going to be chaotic. It's going to be difficult. There are going to be winners and losers, which, like I say, arguably there shouldn't be, but that's just the nature of the beast. But we are going to make the strides that we need to make, along with all other major industries, transportation, concrete. Everyone has their targets, and everyone should be looking to try and improve.
Thank you. What are the big global trends? Is that that's the main one, I imagine, is adapting to new climate targets or requirements?
Two, if you're going to sort of put them in headlines. One, certainly decarbonization, new fuel sources, all of the technology that's evolving around there. The other one is around trying to anticipate trade lanes. And that is we talked a lot about, of course, through the prism of security and national interests. So you're seeing, as a result of this fractioning, that new trade lanes, unanticipated trade lanes are developing, and that's driving what we call ton miles, effectively demand for global shipping.
Understood. Thank you very much. Thank you, George.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.